Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kelly Beard, Content Specialist for Maryland Realtors, and I want to welcome you all to the State of Housing Recap. Today, we have assembled our 2024 President, Chris Hill, CEO, Chuck Caskey, Director of Advocacy and Public Policy, Lisa May, and special guest, pollster Joe Good from American Strategies. Together, they will review the Maryland Realtors State of Housing poll conducted by American Strategies in January 2024. As well, they will address the findings and how they can be used to drive housing policy change at the state and local levels. This webinar will be recorded and sent out to all attendees after the conclusion of the webinar. We do encourage your questions and we look forward to answering them. Please post all your questions in the Q&A box below at the bottom of your Zoom screen. They will be answered at the end of the presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Lisa May. Lisa, take it away.
Kelly, thank you as always, and thank you, Maryland Realtors, for being with us here today. We realize that the state of housing in Maryland has taken on a slightly different flavor now in light of the news that came out on Friday. And it's really tempting. We have Chuck Caskey here, we have Chris Hill here, and we're talking about housing and where it stands. It would be really tempting for us to kind of talk about the settlement. That is not going to happen today. All right, we're going to keep this to our original state of housing topic. For those of you who do have questions about the settlement, I do want to refer you back to the email that came out yesterday under Chris Hill's signature, and with the links that we have to our website and also Friday's webinar, where we will get into that settlement in depth and what it means for all of you and for the industry. But for today, our state of housing refers to a very specific document, and that is an annual housing poll that we conduct each year in coordination with American Strategies. And that poll measures Maryland residents' attitudes and feelings and desires toward our housing market, toward our housing supply, and what they want to see our policymakers do in that housing arena. So that's what we're going to dive into here today. Up first, I'm going to hand it over to the man behind the poll, the one who got us all of this wonderful data, Joe Good from American Strategies. And he is going to walk you through some of the key findings from the 2024 poll and how it relates back to the prior 3 years of polling data that we have also conducted here. So, Joe, thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to let you dive right in.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Joe Good with American Strategies. It's been my privilege to conduct the State of Housing Survey for the Maryland Realtors. I think this is the fourth time we've done it since 2020. So I'm going to walk you through some of the highlights of the survey. As Lisa said, this is a poll of registered voters in Maryland. We make sure that we do a representative sample, we do a random sample, and then make sure we have a representative sample of voters statewide. So we make sure that it's representative geographically, by race, by age, by gender, but it's a scientifically valid survey, and it's going to come with a margin of error attached to it. And I'm going to walk you through those couple of technical things, and then we'll go into the highlights and touch on kind of what we call the top line results and compare those to previous surveys. This presentation and actually a more detailed presentation is available to you, as well as the full questionnaire text. They'll share a link with that at the end of the presentation. So if you really want to geek out and look at some of this data, you'll be able to do that. So with that, I'm going to share my screen here and start my little slideshow. Hopefully that's showing up for everybody.
Looks good, Joe.
Great. So again, the survey is something we've done for you 4 years, starting in the year 2020. We've also done surveys in 2022, 2023, and 2024. Generally, we conduct the survey in January. This year's survey was conducted from January 9th to January 16th. It's a hybrid sample, so we do both live interviews, and we also text links to our potential participants, and they're able to kind of click on a link and take the survey online. So we had a sample of 800 voters this time around. That's going to give us a margin of error of about plus or minus 4 percentage points. And as I noted at the outset, everything is going to be representative of Maryland voters by gender, by party, by region, race, age. And we also have just some owner-renter statistics here. 64% of our participants are homeowners. 35% are either renters or living with friends and family. So let's jump right into the fun stuff. We start every survey with a couple of mood questions. We want to get a sense of how residents are feeling about the direction of the state and what they feel the top issues that they want their elected officials to focus on. So we start with that kind of traditional right direction, wrong track question. And if you're interested in the question wording, it's always going to be down here at the bottom of the slide. And those of you polling aficionados out there will be familiar with this question. It's basically, do you think things in Maryland are going in the right direction, or do you feel things have gone off on the wrong track? And what you can see here is that pre-pandemic, the state was 2-to-1 right direction, 60% right direction, 30% wrong track. When we went back in the field after the pandemic in 2022, voters were a little more mixed, 49-41. Last year, we had a 56% right direction, 38% wrong track. And this year, we're about split. About half the state feels like things are going in the right direction, and about 46% feel that things are off on the wrong track. So a little bit of a mixed bag. And when we ask our respondents what did they think are the biggest issue in Maryland that they would like the governor and the state legislature to focus on, and this is what we call an open-ended question. We didn't give them anything to choice. They told our interviewers, or they typed in what they thought was the top issue. And we got back a real varied list. Crime was number one. 27% of our respondents mentioned crime, violence, gun violence. Those tended to be more in the Baltimore to Washington corridor. So that was the top issue. But you can see here that 3 other issues scored in double digits. So we had kind of a varied issue agenda for our legislators to focus on. Right up there at number 2 was rental increases, housing costs, the cost of housing. We had 15% of our respondents volunteer housing costs as their top concern. That's the first time we've broken into double digits on this volunteered question, equal to things like education and taxes. So that's your first clue that housing is really becoming a top of mind issue for voters. You're seeing that, I think, at the state level. You're seeing President Biden also talking about housing affordability right now. I think housing is going to be a real big issue in the election for November, and you're seeing politicians right now are really putting that to the top of their issue agendas as well. But what's interesting for us is if we look at this demographically, and I looked at renters under the age of 50 and white voters under the age of 50, housing costs, either rent increases, just the cost of housing, what they're paying for mortgage, what it costs to buy a new house, is by far their top volunteered concern. So among renters, 34% of renters said that rental costs, housing costs were their top concern. Only 13% said crime. And among white voters under the age of 50, 26% said housing costs was their top concern, but they wanted the governor to focus on. Only 17% said crime. So I'm going to sound a little bit of a broken record because as I walk through things, these folks under the age of 50 are really focused on housing costs. And this was our first clue when we were going through the data, just how big an issue that housing is for voters in Maryland. So from there in the poll, we start getting a little more shifting our questions to housing affordability and housing supply. And our next question we've been asking, generally speaking, would you say the cost to buy a house in your part of Maryland is too high, about right, or too low? And you can see this red bar. Look how this has gone up over the 4 years that we've been asking this question. In 2020, 57% of the state said housing costs were too high. 2022 went up to 71%. Last year, we had 76%. This year, we're at 82% of registered voters saying that the cost of housing in Maryland is just too high. That's pretty much, you don't see numbers like that very often. When things get into the 80 percentile, there's no demographic variation to it. Everyone's in agreement that the cost to buy a house in their part of Maryland is too high. And when we ask about how about the cost to rent an apartment in your part of Maryland, is that too high, about right, or too low? You see that same trend. We topped out at 80% last year. We're at 81% again this year. So this isn't just a Baltimore issue or a Montgomery County issue or a upscale suburban issue. This is statewide. Everybody's feeling these pressures that saying the cost to buy or rent housing in Maryland is just too high. It's getting a little bit out of hand, and we're going to personalize that a bit in a second. But we also wanted to get a sense of how voters felt about the job that their elected officials were doing in dealing with housing affordability and supply. So we'd say, how do you rate the job being done by the governor and the Maryland State Legislature on the issue of housing affordability and supply? Would you say they're doing an excellent, good, just fair, or poor job? And this graph kind of groups excellent and good in green and just fair and poor in red. And you can see, even back in 2020, 63% didn't like the job that the governor and the state legislature were doing. But look at how that has gone up to now 33% say they're doing a poor job, almost double what we saw in 2020. The plurality say they're doing a just fair job. And look at how that good number has dropped from 24 to 15%. So not surprising when people say the cost of housing is too high, they're not giving the governor or the state officials a very good job performance. And we followed that question up with, well, how about your city and county governments? What kind of job are they doing on housing affordability and housing supply? And if anything, they're doing even worse. Look at the intensity. I always like to look at his intensity as a pollster. Percent saying that they're doing a poor job has gone from 22% in 2020 up to 40% in 2024. So that's not a good report card for our city and county officials on dealing with housing affordability and housing supply. And again, I think you're seeing that's why so many of these folks are starting to get out a little more front on this issue and wanting to do things about it. They're hearing about it from their constituents. They're hearing about housing costs, rental costs, and they see that they're getting a very poor job rating on that issue. So from there, we wanted to get a sense of how voters perceive the availability of certain types of housing for certain types of constituencies and certain kinds of housing. So we said, look, still thinking about housing, please tell me if you think there is too little, too much, or the right amount of each of the following in your part of Maryland. And we asked about 7 or 8 types of different questions. Housing for younger people and those just getting started in their careers. Housing for people with low incomes in your part of Maryland. Housing for people with moderate incomes in your part of Maryland. Housing for older people who are looking to downsize or have special needs in your part of Maryland. So I'm going to stop at those 4 and just look over here. 73% say that there is too little housing available for younger people and those just getting started in their careers in their part of Maryland. 73%, almost 3 out of 4. 66% say there is too little housing available for people with low incomes in their part of Maryland. 65% say that there's too little housing available for people with moderate incomes in their part of Maryland. So you're really seeing how it's not just a issue for low-cost housing or just young people. People with moderate incomes, the perception is there's not enough housing available for them. Older people looking to downsize, 62%, too little of that kind of housing available. Single-family homes available to purchase in your part of Maryland, almost half, 49%, said that there was too little single-family housing available to buy. And places to rent, 48% saying there's too little of that in their part of Maryland. So that kind of puts some numbers on just the different types of places to buy or rent in different constituencies. People really perceive this shortage, not just for themselves, but for their kids, for people with moderate incomes, for people with lower incomes. The one little hiccup in this question was when we asked, how about new houses and apartments being built in your part of Maryland? Only 37% said too little. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but there's still kind of this disconnect that people have between construction and availability that I think we do need to educate voters about. 3 interesting trends on these questions that I wanted to flag. And again, there's demographic breakouts in that final report that you can download. We don't have time to go through everything today, but I do want to flag 3 trends for you on this idea of housing for people with moderate incomes. Back in 2020, only 46% said there was too little housing available for people with moderate incomes. That has gone up every year since then, 52% in 2022, 61% in 2023, and this year, 65%, almost 2/3, said there's too little housing available for people with moderate incomes. Look at that same trend on single-family homes available to purchase. 30% too little in 2020, up to 49%, half this year is saying there's too little single-family homes available to purchase. And look at places to rent. You're seeing that same swing up. 34%, 1/3 said that in 2020, but this year it's up to 48%. And you see how it's really taken a big jump over the 4 years that we've been doing this survey. One other thing that I wanted to flag on the time series data, when you look at this type of housing available for people with moderate incomes, the big shift has happened among voters under the age of 50. Back in 2020, only 44% of voters under the age of 50 said there was too little housing available for people with moderate incomes. But look at how that jumped 10 points by 2022, up to 61% in 2023. And this year, 72% of people under the age of 50 say there's too little housing available for people with moderate incomes in their part of Maryland. That's not to say that older people don't feel the same way, but I think this trend that we're seeing among our voters under 50, and you read about it in the paper, millennials saying, oh, I'll never be able to afford a home. There's not enough homes out there. You see how that trend is very much reflected in our data as well. Now, from the macro, we wanted to get a sense of how these housing costs are affecting them personally. So we asked a couple of questions about how housing costs are affecting their budget and their decision to whether to stay or leave in Maryland. So the first question we ask at the personal level is, how much of a financial strain on your budget is paying your rent or mortgage each month? Is paying your rent or mortgage a significant strain, a slight strain, not much of a strain, or no strain at all? And here's our numbers from 2024. You can see that 55%, half of the state, says that what they're paying for rent or mortgage is either a significant strain, 25%, or at least a slight strain in their budget, 29%. So that's 55% overall. That's similar to where we were in 2023. We had 50%, so it's a 5-point bump, but the real intensity numbers stayed about the same at 25%. But you can see how that's gone up from 2020. I mean, even then, I probably said when 4 in 10 are feeling strained by housing costs, that's a lot. Well, we're up 15 points since then. And the people who say it's a significant strain is up 5 points since 2020. So half the state feeling very strained by what they're paying for rent or mortgage. But if you look at this one demographically, look at our renters. 53% of renters say that what they pay in rent each month is a significant strain on their monthly budget. Half of renters feel that way. Another 33% feel what they're paying for rent is at least a slight strain in their budget. So that's 86. Just about every renter is feeling strained by what they're paying for rent each month. And you can see some other trends here as well in terms of age. Homeowners not feeling quite as strained, but 43% of homeowners also feeling strained or slightly strained by what they're paying. When we ask our folks, does the cost of housing make you think about moving from your current home or not? And then we follow that up with, does it make you think about moving out of Maryland or moving somewhere else in Maryland? We have 33% who say that the cost of housing is making them think about moving from their current home. 23% feel like what Maryland housing costs are costing is making them think about leaving the state. So that's a real brain drain. It's very similar to what we saw last year. 22% also said they were thinking about leaving the state last year. But again, that's 1 in 5 registered voters feeling like, you know, these housing costs are really hurting us. I'm thinking about even moving out of the state because housing's so expensive here. And if you look at that by age, again, here's our 18 to 34-year-olds. Here's our 35 to 49-year-olds. 30% and 28% are feeling that the cost of housing is making them think about leaving the state, just housing costs. So that's a real threat, I think a real red flag for everybody when our younger folks are feeling like, I can't afford to buy a house, I can't afford to rent here, I'm thinking of leaving the state. We really don't want to see that. And I think, again, when you guys did your press conference, the folks really were reacting to that, and your elected officials were very interested in that number. So the other question that we've asked this year, we've asked this all 4 years, these numbers haven't changed much, but we wanted to get a sense from our residents and registered voters, what are the biggest obstacles to buying a home? And we gave them 7 or 8 things. We asked, how much of an obstacle is this to buying a home Is it a huge obstacle, a medium-sized obstacle, a small obstacle, or not an obstacle at all? This graph shows whether it's a huge obstacle or a medium-sized obstacle. And the top 4 obstacles to buying a home: having a full-time job and not making enough to afford a home, 65% said that was a huge obstacle. Another 24% said it was a medium-sized obstacle. Interest rates, clearly, I know you guys are all hearing this out there, but 62% said that interest rates are a huge obstacle to their ability to buy a home. Having enough money to pay for down payment and closing costs, 56%, huge obstacle. And folks are cognizant that high construction costs, the cost for materials, the cost for labor are really driving up housing costs, and they understand that that's part of what's going into these high housing costs. Consumer credit card debt, student debt, and banks making it hard, those are also obstacles. You can see they drop below our kind of 50% majority on the huge obstacle. But really, it comes down to having that full-time job, but not being enough to save up to make that down payment, and interest rates are really what's holding folks back from being able to buy that first home or get into a home. Couple of things on the regulatory front. We did want to get a sense from our respondents how they felt about some issues. So we did ask whether they agreed or disagreed with a couple of statements. A couple of these I want to flag for you here. We said, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? There are too many local rules and regulations that make it hard to build homes that Marylanders can afford. Not surprisingly, Republicans, 75% agreed with that statement, but 78% of independent voters, these are self-identified independents, agreed with that statement. 49% strongly agreed with it, even more than Republicans. But what's also interesting is that even 57% of Democrats feel like there are too many local rules and regulations that are making it hard to build homes that Marylanders can afford. So this idea that there's so many rules or regulations, you guys have really broken through, I think, with that argument among the general public. And folks are really getting an understanding that there's a lot of, hoops that people have to jump through, I's they got to dot, T's they have to cross, that are really driving up housing costs. And again, we were able to share that number with local officials and show that how the public is perceiving that regulatory environment is not conducive to home building in Maryland. Now, one other question we wanted to ask and get an agree, disagree on was whether or not building more housing will help bring down the overall cost of housing in Maryland. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? And interestingly here, only half of our voters, 53%, felt like, yes, building more housing will help bring down housing costs. 45% disagreed with that statement. And we did some focus groups for y'all last year. And what we saw was that a lot of people feel like, oh, these houses are being built all right, but they're not housing that we can afford. They're McMansions, they're luxury apartments. So they were really skeptical about this statement in our focus group. What's interesting here is that if you look at it by party, Democrats actually kind of are on board. 58% agree that building more housing, that supply-demand equation will help. It's our Republicans who are a little skeptical about this. I think they see nothing but McMansions going up, and 57% of our Republicans disagreed with the idea that building more housing will bring down housing costs. Independents were kind of split. But again, I think this is another one where we need to do a little more reminding folks of their high school economics or college economics class of supply and demand, that increasing supply should help bring down costs. And then one other question we wanted to get at was this idea of missing middle housing. Most folks don't understand what we mean by missing middle. And we explained that in the question text, what we meant by missing middle housing. So we said, look, some people say that to bring down housing costs, Maryland needs more neighborhoods where single-family homes can be built closer together, and that also include different kinds of housing options, like accessory dwelling units. We'd had a question about that in the poll, townhomes, duplexes, and triplexes. This is often called missing middle housing. In general, do you think new neighborhood developments with these missing middle housing options would be a good fit or a bad fit for your part of Maryland? So we kind of wanted to get at that kind of NIMBY attitude out there and really lay it out and say, how about in your part of Maryland, are you ready for this kind of more dense housing? And we did have that 55% felt like that denser missing middle housing would be a good fit for their part of Maryland. Only 24% said that would be a very good fit. But again, I think when you think about how much folks are strained by housing, how little housing they see, this is a good number when 55% are saying, yeah, missing middle housing would be good in my part of Maryland. And over here, you got the folks who are those more NIMBY crowd, especially the 17% here, saying that, no, that's not a very good fit for my part of Maryland where I live. And if you break this out kind of by urban, suburban, and rural, you're going to see that urban dwellers, they're already comfortable with dense housing. So 61% felt like, yeah, I'm on board. But even 55% of suburban voters felt like this would be a good fit. It's only when we get out to the rural areas that people are a little more skeptical about whether that's a good fit for their area. And you can see Prince George's, Montgomery, Greater Baltimore, and Anne Arundel, they were all pretty much on board with more missing middle housing, even if that meant kind of that dense duplex, triplex type of housing. So that's a lot of data, a lot of numbers. Like I said, there's a longer report. I think your takeaways that you want to think about: housing affordability, it's seen as a worsening problem and all across the state. Remember how those first couple of slides I showed you showed out people that housing costs are too high, whether you're looking to buy or rent. That's a trend that we've seen for 4 years now. There's a real lack of housing now. People perceive that not just lack of housing for people with low incomes, but also there's a lack of housing for people with moderate incomes. There's too little housing available for young people, lower income people, and seniors as well. Wages not keeping up with housing prices, trouble saving for a down payment, and increased interest rates are the biggest obstacles to buying a home. Voters agreeing that there are too many rules and regulations that make it hard to build affordable homes, but they're split on whether more housing are going to bring down housing costs. We did ask some questions about ADUs. I didn't share those with you here, but voters are very open to accessory dwelling units. And then we had that last slide about the missing middle housing. So that's a lot. I don't know if there are some questions in there, but we're happy to entertain or talk some more about that, or turn it back over to Lisa.
Well, Joe, thank you. I mean, I'm more than happy to geek out with you. I love this stuff. This is great. I don't see anything in the Q&A right now, but for those of you who are listening along, if you have a question for Joe, we're going to have him stay here with us for the rest of the hour. But, you know, look, it's great. We have this data, but it also matters how we use it, how we get it out there in front of the people who are making these housing decisions. And one thing that we at Maryland Realtors have done is we hold an annual press conference where we walk reporters and policymakers, you know, through this data to talk to them so that they come from a shared understanding of what the actual state of housing is. And I'm going to pause right here, just because we did have a question for Joe before I hop into how we use it. So Joe, if you were designing a persuasion campaign to the voting public, what would it look like? And we may be able to chime in on some of this too about how ours looks like, but I'll let you take that one.
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends, but I think that we're in the great, not great. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where the public overwhelmingly agrees with us. And really what you want to do is personalize it as much as possible. So you really want to show that millennial couple that's, two income, but just aren't anywhere in, being able to afford a home. You want to show that family that, is renting and they want to, have a 2 or 3 bedroom rental so their kids have a place to do homework. Their kids have a good quality housing to come home to, and there's just aren't enough rentals available. So what I would want to do is really put a face on these numbers. I think that's always your best way to kind of tell stories that people can relate to. And, I'm hearing this in focus groups that I'm doing, older folks, they want to downsize, but there's no place for them to downsize to. And they have these low interest rates and they're not, sure they want to give up that low interest rate. That's an obstacle too. But you want to show those folks who want to downsize. You want to show those folks who want to move up, but you just want to personalize it as much as possible and tell those personal stories because they're very relatable to people because either they or someone they know are in that same type of situation.
So Lisa, did we mention that I'm sorry, did we mention that the full report is on Open Doors, Maryland? Did I miss that? I'm sorry.
Yes, absolutely. You can. And we will email this out to every attendee here today as well. The full report plus a 2-page infographic that our wonderful communications staff put together. Both of those are available on right there, opendoorsmaryland.org. And we'll email you direct links following the presentation today. I did want to talk to our president, Chris Hill, and our CEO, Chuck Caskey, because we take these results every year, as I mentioned, and we hold a press conference to unveil these results. We have it right down on State Circle in Annapolis, and talk about these, try to get the broader community engaged on these housing issues and the problems that exist. So Chris, why don't you tell us, since you were, front and center at that press conference, what kind of things did we talk about, and how did that go, kind of getting this information out to the public?
Well, actually, thank you. And Joe, great. I love the information. This has been my third year of kind of absorbing it and seeing how we can utilize it and do something with it. I think this year there was such a dramatic answer in most of the polling questions that it became very easy for others to go, wow, and their eyes perked up. So when we had the privilege of presenting this for our press conference, I think the overwhelming response was, I didn't know that. That's pretty powerful numbers, and it creates dramatic pause, I think, for many people, and they get to look at it and go, wow. And we've been Chuck, I'm sure you've been around longer, but you see that this information is critically important for us to have in our arsenal, if you will, to go after, to talk to our legislators and tell them, hey, look, we have a problem here and we need to fix it, and here's some solutions. At least it makes us also have value in the conversation, because now we've got data, right? We can support ourselves with voting data, which, let's be real, that's pretty meaningful to them. And it's meaningful to us too, but it's really meaningful to them. So it gives us a backbone for our message. It's kind of where I truly enjoyed the press conference, the opportunity to present the data. I'm a realtor, so sometimes I become a little more ADHD with stuff, and it's hard for me to absorb, but the dramatic stuff is what really stands out with our members, I think. And when you can state facts like that, it gives you reason to pause, and I appreciate that. So
let's address the open question here, because literally, not even virtually, literally every time we talk about density and additional housing, somebody raises adequate public facilities, infrastructure, et cetera. And so we can actually write the response, whether it's from MACO, MML, whomever, whenever we talk about that. So the answer to the question is, if the question is, and I reject the premise of the question even just a little bit, how can you build it without the infrastructure? The obvious answer is you can't. And the follow-up response, however, is multifaceted. And I think, first of all, when people talk about the adequate public facilities ordinances, and I think every local jurisdiction has one, and it covers obviously roads, schools, water and sewer. Those are the things. It even covers public safety and things like that. But if we focus on roads, schools, water and sewer, you have to think about it in a couple of ways. And the first is what are the underlying assumptions on these adequate public facilities ordinances? And I would challenge anybody who wants to say we don't have the school capacity or we don't have the road capacity to really read the APFO, how many people have read their county's adequate public facilities ordinance? I would suggest very few, if any. And the reason I stress that is because with all of those things, they're based on assumptions. They're based on assumptions that so-called experts make about how many children are going to be in every new house that we build, how many miles are they going to be traveled, how much water and sewer capacity is required for each new resident for whom we build a home. And I would suggest that a lot of those are outdated and old assumptions, and that may not even be accurate today, and if they were ever accurate. So I challenge the accuracy of the underlying assumptions in a lot of adequate public facilities ordinances. Second, it's a matter of will and desire to fund improvements when they are necessary. Because as one of the wealthiest states in the country, in the wealthiest country in the world, we don't lack the capacity to build infrastructure to support the growth that we know is coming. So that becomes a political decision, not a physical facilities one. And so if the will is there, if the political will is there, we can make it work. And when you look at in the ADU question that was answered by in writing, we are stuck right now. And when you listen, if you're following the Harford County example, for example, the debate up in Harford County, people are going on the assumption that if ADUs are made easier to build in Harford County, that everybody's going to build an ADU. And Lisa, when we study it, what is the actual rate of adoption of ADUs in these
An
jurisdictions?
excellent ADU adoption rate is 1 to 2% of lots.
So they and very often there are no children. There are and these are different. These people have different needs and have different impacts on infrastructure. And so this is a very nuanced discussion. It can't be made into a bumper sticker. And so, yes, we know every time you talk about density, triplexes, duplexes, middle housing, ADUs, people say adequate public facilities. That's the wrong question. The right question is, how do we provide the infrastructure to facilitate the growth that we know is coming? That's the right answer. Or that's the right question.
Well, Chuck, we discussed this. We discussed this
from the surveys that we haven't seen that from policymakers.
Chuck said before, and I wanted to stress that, this is about planning, not zoning, right? This is that conversation about planning for the future it requires is a totally different concept than zoning is currently. And I'm with you. I had an argument recently where the conversation was, we're going to have this small little subdivision in Southern Maryland. We're going to add so much traffic to the roads. And my argument was that the people buying those townhomes for this instance were already living in their parents' basements. So they're already on the roads. They're not affecting the roadway, currently. So these are arguments that the data that we have helps us fight, I think, really.
Well, and Chris, I think that's a key point is we have data, and two, it backs up our position that of the need for housing, that the public is actually where we are when it comes to housing. It's actually the policymakers that are kind of lagging behind what's actually going on. But I think we also saw, and I would get Chris and Chuck's feedback on this, is that when you get this type of data in front of the right policymakers, they take it and run with it and amplify it and internalize it into what they're doing. And I think that, we saw that a little bit with the Secretary of Housing, Jake Day, and with Governor Moore. So Chuck, Chris, would one of you, kind of like to talk about that experience of how we moved, this data beyond just a Realtor talking point into a more general public policy state of Maryland talking point?
I think, having a representative from the governor's office, I think we are having this information gives us way more credibility with the governor's office and more than I think we've ever had. And having Jake Day at our press conference was was a sign of that they're recognizing that the data we're providing is meaningful and helpful in the argument of housing in Maryland. And I truly believe that we've taken a step in the right direction with the administration now, and it to some degree created a bit of a coalition or partner in the administration. And you know, if we can get back to that missing middle housing conversation, as Chuck said before, if we can get missing middle or middle housing written into Maryland code, we made a major milestone in what we've accomplished.
Yeah, and I also think framing this discussion, the situation as a crisis. I mean, that's a word that we have been using for 4 years or more. And when we first heard Secretary Day use that word when in the context of releasing the administration's housing package, we were ecstatic because it was very refreshing to have that partnership, as you said, at the highest level of state government to finally recognize that it's a problem and of crisis proportions. And the message is there is some good news here. So even though, you know, for example, there's a bill in Harford County on ADUs, not to belabor that point, it's not going as smoothly as we hoped it would. And there's opposition from people we don't understand how they can be opposed to it. But the point is that people are finally confronting this. If they come out doing the right thing, that's a conversation for another day. And yes, it's going to be an incremental progress. You know, to the extent we have and make progress, it will be slow and to slower than we hoped it would be because there is still strong opposition. And, you know, if we're being honest, it's because local governments have the stranglehold on land use policy in the state of Maryland, but we are making very good progress. I think even at the local level, Anne Arundel, I think their ADU bill is pretty good, if I'm not mistaken, Lisa. But, you know, we do have to keep the pressure on, and I think we are making progress. I feel good that we are, that our version of events, right? Because words matter, right? So you're calling it a crisis. We're going to continue to call it a crisis, and we're going to push this concept of middle housing. And to echo Chris's point, that if we are moving the debate forward using terms that are the terms we have chosen, then that's a win, right? Because we all know how you frame these issues matters how people think of them. And so I feel we've made substantial progress in that regard. Would you agree, Lisa?
Yeah, I would. And, you know, we have talked about the governor does have a housing package that is currently moving through the General Assembly. We actually expect that housing supply bill, which is Senate Bill 484 and House Bill 583. We expect the House version of that to be debated and moved forward this week. But even with that, let's say the governor's housing package passes. Let's say next session we do get, you know, a statewide ADU bill. As much as I would love to have that kind of power and to wave that magic wand and just say, okay, we did statewide legislation, we're good now, we don't have to do this. It's not reality. We're being very honest with each other here on this webinar. These housing discussions and these housing decisions are always going to have to come down to the local level. You know, we're not the West Coast where all of these planning and zoning decisions are made up at the state level. It's going to have to come down to the debates that are within your own communities. So it's going to be up to, you know, our members and our local associations to show up and to fight those fights and to really take this data that we have and get it in front of your local elected officials or your local economic development agencies, or, you know, any of those other kind of coalitions of, you know, business groups who are having trouble recruiting workers are, having trouble expanding in Maryland because housing costs are so high. We know that those conversations are taking place. It's, will our local realtors engage in that process and be the ones to show up and speak up and be that counterpoint to the NIMBYs who are going to be there no matter what?
Yeah, and they're some of the loudest messages, and there's so much good literature out there now, including, I mean, and that's why I say we're making progress, because outside of the realtor bubble, because we're all obviously concerned with the settlement and all the lawsuits and all that stuff, but outside of our realm and what we happen to be focused on at the moment, this conversation about zoning, local land use control, and are there better ways to do it, are really coming to the fore. I mean, you can research, and there's a lot of good articles. The Atlantic just did one last June that I thought was really, really good. And it was called "Do Local Governments Have Too Much Control Over Land Use?" I mean, it basically laid out the premise that the fact that the county council members, county commissioners, city council people are the closest it gets to the voters, right? And so when you have a public hearing or a charrette or something, the only people who come out are the opponents, no matter what size a development is. At a public hearing, the developer will present the plan, and nobody will speak. They'll in favor of it, but they'll line up around the block to speak in opposition to it. And that's who the county council, city council, county commissioners, that's who they hear from. And so and they are closest to the voters, and they want to get reelected. It's really hard to not notice, because those are the loudest voices. And so that's part of the problem. And so we are starting to make the point that, maybe you need some more state intervention in certain respects. And this is an East Coast thing, out West, they don't have the same relationship with local control. And so part of this is re-education on what it really means to act globally, not just so locally.
Yes, and I have a great question actually from one of our local legislative chairs, who I know is going to take this and run. But is there a condensed version of the presentation? And there actually is. We have that 2-page infographic that our communication staff prepared. We will email that out to all of you. But if you're dying to have it right this second, go to opendoorsmaryland.org, and there's a banner on the homepage that talks about housing supply. And has the link to the full presentation and our 2-page infographic. But one thing I want to add, apart from the infographic, because that is a statewide response, it gives the statewide, percentages. In Joe's full presentation, some of our larger areas, our big counties, and some of our metro areas, you have more specific results for your area. And it might be really good for you to look at those, because in some cases, depending on what the stat is, they're even higher, or the need is even stronger in those areas than what we see statewide. So that's a really good way to, personalize this down to your community. In addition to, of course, our housing market stats that our communications department puts out. Those are you who are on the Realtor Property Resource. You can pull reports by, zip code or, by neighborhood, that really can reinforce, hey, here's what's happening on the ground that you as a policymaker need to be addressing. It's hard data. You can't run from it. So let's have the discussion on that basis and on that floor, as opposed to something that's more abstract and emotional.
And again, that infographic and the full report are on opendoorsmaryland.org.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important. One of the more striking results from the polling, which you never see 99% of poll respondents say anything. But the respondents ages 18 to 34, 99% say it's harder to buy a home today than for previous generations. And even Housing Secretary Day at our press conference noted that, because we handed that out, and he saw that 99%. And he actually said in the press conference, you've never seen 99, right, Joe? I mean, you were
No, you don't ever see
80-some%. You're like, oh my God, you never see that. When was the last time 99% of people agreed on anything in a poll you conducted?
Right.
And
it's not just our polls too. I mean, I think Lisa had another poll that was out, and like I said earlier in the presentation, there's a reason why President Biden had it in his State of the Union address, right? Housing, and you're seeing it in a lot of the other state legislatures that we work with too. So it's just a front and center issue for folks right now.
And Joe, I'm not a pollster, but if it's a 99% with a plus or minus of 4, does that mean 103% of people feel that way? Doesn't quite work that way. I know.
Doesn't quite work that way, no.
95 to 103%. Yeah.
There we go. There we go. We are almost out of time here, but certainly want to answer any remaining questions that are out there from our audience. So if you have anything that you want us to address before we break here today, please put it in the Q&A. But of course, this session is being recorded, and we will send out links to the full report, the infographic, and maybe any other links that we think might be of help to you as you take these discussions to your policymakers. So I'll give it, maybe another 30 seconds just to see if anyone has anything. But of course, we are going to continue talking about this. And I think we've been really fortunate that our leadership has been willing to really have these very open discussions. We don't send out a press release on real estate stats in Maryland without tying it to our housing shortage, without having a quote from President Chris Hill about what we're seeing out there, about how we need action if we want, this situation to improve. If we don't want to keep saying that inventory is down and prices are increasing faster than our residents can afford. And me stalling there has allowed a couple of questions to come in. Oh, no, just some compliments. Well, we'll still take those. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Hung on to the very end. So once again, thank you very much. Joe, thanks as always for great work.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Big thanks to Joe Good and American Strategies for conducting this poll for us. And of course, we'll be back with our next one in 2025. And we'll see if we start to get those numbers trending in the right direction for housing in Maryland. And so with that, and on behalf of our president, Chris Hill, our CEO, Chuck Caskey, Joe Good from American Strategies, our wonderful producer, Kelly Beard, and myself, thank you all for joining us. Go out and advocate for housing. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Sign up for Friday's webinar.
Friday webinar, yeah.
Friday, be there.